Good evening. I'm Jessie Gray. The program is Books. With us tonight is a very distinguished author, Carl Weiss. Thank you for coming. He's the author of Terror in the Prisons, published by Bobbs Merrill. And I'd like to read you a short review of Terror in the Prisons by Dr. Carl Menninger before we begin the program. Dr. Menninger says, the authors simply describe what goes on every night, including tonight, in jails and prisons all over the country. It isn't pretty, it's just plain terrible. Rape after rape, beating after beating, cruelty after cruelty, with a general understanding that those who are permitted these acts won't be surprised at any of these reports. This book should be read by anyone who is complacent or optimistic about jails. It's a soul-disturbing, peace of mind disturbing, gut-disturbing book about what we are doing in the way of utter wickedness, cruelty, and self-defeat to young boys. Thank you very much for coming.
You're very welcome. Delighted to be here.
I'd like you to describe, if you would, as you do in your book, a typical initiation into prison life for someone who has never been there before or who is returning to prison.
In the many interviews I've done of prisoners, both inside the prisons as well as outside, they've described what happened the first time they were brought into prison. One we call Helga. She worked for Compass House, which is a treatment center on West 17th Street here in New York City. And she described her first visit, her first arrest and incarceration in a New York City prison. This was in the Women's House of Detention. She said that she was brought in a prison van where she immediately was accosted by a woman homosexual.
A fellow prisoner?
A fellow prisoner, yeah. Helga made certain that I understand that she doesn't negate homosexuality, but she does object to a heterosexual or homosexual assault on herself. The woman attempted to handle her, and ultimately, there in the van, become intimate, literally assault her sexually. She fought her off, and at that particular time, this woman who was very abusive to her became very abusive simultaneously to the police who were taking the prisoners out of the van. At that moment, the police separated her from separated the assaulter, the woman assaulter, from the rest of the prisoners. And when Helga saw her later that evening, the woman had had a number of bones broken. She'd been thoroughly beaten and had been sexually assaulted by the police, who said that since she was such a habitual rapist, that they would give her some of her own medicine. Helga...
These were the police who were taking her or
right.
The prison?
These were people who had been opened the van to take the prisoners out of the van and into the Women's House of Detention. Helga was very indignant. It's one thing to be assaulted by a rapist. It's another to have the rapist so destroyed that the lesson, any kind of constructiveness, any kind of a... in brief, if you destroy the rapist, what you will get is a much more avenging, vicious rapist thereafter.
Especially when the rapist is destroyed by more rapists.
Right, right. When Helga got into the prison, she was examined and found that her body was exposed to a variety of people, male and female, that that she was examined for venereal disease, again with no privacy, and also with instruments which were not sanitized, so that the very objective of presumably helping the new prisoner to overcome venereal disease was not only in grave danger of giving them a disease they did not have, but also raised a very serious question to Helga, who happened to have a couple of years of college and therefore was literate and fairly. She had a combination of formal education and street smarts. She'd been taken in as a prostitute, you see. She raised the question as to whether the prisons have a right to examine for venereal disease whomever enters the prison. Just as, for example, the walking population in the United States would be terribly indignant if vans would be sent throughout the city to pick up at random people and find out they have venereal disease and want to help them. This is hardly helping.
And especially
this was her initiation.
When you say that they didn't use even, they just went down the line with the same instrument through all of the people they medically inspected.
Right.
Was that a conscious effort, in effect, to say, I don't care if I give you a disease?
There are many dynamics, many motivations, many causes why it occurs. It ranges all the way from inadequate, incompetent personnel to, that is, improperly trained personnel, to materials that didn't arrive, so that there's a question of, is it incompetency through lack of training, or is it also a lack of a budget? Is there not enough money for instruments? Is there not enough money for rooms to be built to give proper privacy?
Or perhaps
is there also an indifference? Is there also a mood in the prison where both the prisoner and the correction staff very rapidly arrive at a position where the prisoner recognizes that the only role of the prison is to destroy them? There is not a rehabilitation, there is not anything constructive. By and large, there are exceptions. I've interviewed and have gone to the places where there are exceptions. But the exceptions are the tiniest percentage. The vast majority, we're talking now in the high 90s, the high 90% have this kind of a ambience, this type of environment, this destruction going on.
Do the young juveniles who are in what you'd call rehabilitation centers rather than prisons, are they also subjected to this?
The young juveniles are subjected exactly to this, except that the euphemisms are different. The whole prison language, by the way, uses rather fake camouflage language for what is real. They will talk about protective custody. That's putting you in the hole, in the isolation pit, where there's absolutely no protection for your survival. You're literally desensitized. All of your sensory responses have been practically destroyed. You're well on the way to become psychotic. Tests, by the way, with the Air Force by volunteers have found that if our senses are not stimulated sufficiently, that within 8 or 10 hours, the average normal human will become schizophrenic. They have a break with reality. And here in these holes, no light, no sanitation, literally little oxygen, little or no food, terrorization continuously, beatings, so that prisons might be considered one of the corridors of making our hundreds of thousands of prisoners psychotics.
Now, in prison itself, there is an inmate hierarchy based on brutality, is there not?
Yes. This is never talked about. We'll talk about it because this is what I found, and also what I find all those in prison work know about. But it's rarely discussed.
Why isn't it discussed?
It isn't discussed for a whole host of reasons. The newspapers, for example, have a tendency to say, all we do is report the news. We can't go into depth. Yet, if you examine any newspaper, whether it's the Daily News or the New York Times, you'll find that when they wish, that they go into a long background of the history, the origin of a given news story, parallels with it, all those involved, projections, what may occur. So it's not quite so that journalism, whether it's newspapers, magazines, or broadcast media, cannot go into depth. But they don't go into the statement of the hierarchy by saying that if we're describing a riot, we're not going to tell you about the hierarchy of who runs the riot, what do the majority of prisons have to say or not say about a prison riot. They just don't say anything about it. You've asked, what is the hierarchy there? Yes. It's a very basic hierarchy that exists in all prisons but a few. The few that I know of and are existing, these are very few, don't have a hierarchy of prisoner control. One of them is Bucks County Prison in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. Warden John Case there says he doesn't warehouse his prisoners, and he will not allow warehousing, meaning that the prisoners have no power to deal with anything that's happening to them. That's warehousing. Mental patients, by the way, very recently have been found throughout the United States to be warehoused. They have nothing to say in the hospital about their status, and they have nothing to say about the non-existent treatment. But we're not on mental institutions today, we're on prisons. I'll come back to that. Warden Case of Bucks County Prison does not warehouse his prisoners. He's given them a host of significant self-governing organizations inside the prison, and he does his utmost to get them out of the prison as soon as he can to halfway houses, where they get their high school, if they didn't get their high school education, college, if they want college and are willing and able to do it, and they also help to find jobs in this halfway house procedure. This is the rarity. 95, 98% of our prisons, at least, if they give a token to this kind of a situation, it's a lot.
Well, you mentioned, too, he gives them self-government, but again, self-government without the proper structure for it, it leads to absolute brutality among the inmates, does it not? The
right.
Most brutal becoming the, what is the name for it, in charge of the others?
Wolves, tier bosses, there are hundreds and hundreds of terms. Let me say this, that Warden Case, fortunately, and I say this very carefully now, he's an ex-major from the Marines. He's about 6'6", and as tough and as unyielding as they come. Nobody fools around with Warden Case in the prison or out. They have tried to their dismay and disaster. When he sets up structures there with the prisoners, he works with a whole host of experts to see that the prisoners are ready for each step of their liberation. Psychiatrists are brought in. If there's no budget at the Doylestown prison, he gets them to volunteer. He has 200 volunteers a week inside that prison of experts, social workers, MDs, psychiatrists, psychologists, teachers, educators, counselors, job vocation trainers. In brief, he says, if you don't give me the budget, which you don't give me, I'll just get it from the community. And he's articulate enough, he's bright enough, he's charismatic enough that he can get this kind of voluntary service. Now, there's only one Warden Case in the United States. If every prison was inhabited by literally a physical and mental giant like Warden John Case, we probably could have our incredibly meager, inadequate prison budgets and still have the prisons rehabilitate rather than make even more criminal, more destructive, more dangerous the prisoners, so that when they ultimately come out, and as 99% of prisoners always come out, they come out far more endangering the community than they entered.
Now, you mention in your book, and I think everybody does know this, that people who have committed fairly minor crimes, or who in fact are eventually judged innocent but simply cannot afford bail, are incarcerated with very hard and brutal men or women who rape and beat, burn them to the point where they come out absolutely mentally deranged or else very hostile and
Yes, this is not, by the way, a solution, what I'm going to say now. And in a sense, I think the audience must get solutions, but unfortunately, before a solution, they also have to find out what the problem is, what the illness is, what the dangerous condition, not alone to the prisoners, but essentially to the community in the United States, means to them. At that time, they would be ready, the audience that is, to examine solutions. Otherwise, they don't see a point for a solution where there is no problem.
The problem is that almost everyone going into prison has to either defend themselves by becoming, what, very violent, or...
Helga, by the way, found out that she had to as-if her way through the prison. She entered the prison and found out very rapidly that there are a host of rapists inside the women's house of detention who raid or rape her. There are a host of people, inmates that is. There are a good deal of staff who do this too. But we're talking now about the inmates to begin with. The inmates a very strong percentage of them, a large percentage, are ready to rape prisoners, whether they're old hands or utter novices. They're also ready to physically assault them for a variety of reasons.
What
to
reasons?
literally rob them, steal from them, remove any property that they may have, literally remove their freedom to walk. They can be made flunkies, slavies inside the prison, cowed, ready at the beck and call of a tougher inmate. Now, she found very rapidly, she first tried to get a little bit of an alliance with some of the prisoners there so that she'd have a defense when she saw what was happening. When she saw that didn't occur, she's a very quick-witted person. She as-ifed, which means that although she's not a tough person personally, she's not an aggressive person personally, that's not her personality, she literally swaggered. She pulled herself to her full height. The language that dripped out of her lips now was of the most obscene and the most dangerous sounding. In brief, she tried to prepare herself to look like a one-woman army. And she said that heaven help the weakling who enters a prison. This is one thing. She also asked to get, if you happen to know anybody there, make an alliance very quickly with them. And also, if you get anyone who offers an alliance, don't accept it, because they may be leading you up the primrose path. They may be setting you up to take advantage. They frequently give you cigarettes, toothbrush, etc., and after that will make demands, such again as sexual demands, money demands, etc.
Well, now, if a prisoner is raped, well, and as you say, a great many are.
The majority of prisoners are facing it. In other words, of the 600,000 or 700,000 prisoners in the United States today, the vast majority in their prison stay will find that they are regularly threatened with rape, and a goodly number of them will be raped fairly constantly. Once you're raped, it becomes the grapevine news, and you're raped not only in that prison, but any other prison you enter, your record precedes you. Records both in the files as well as in the grapevine of the prisoners.
Well, now, what happens to a prisoner who's raped, who tries to tell a guard about it? You describe it in your book.
It literally
for
can't
the
be
audience.
done. It can't be done. When it's done, it's the most grisly thing possible. The prisons have a code, which is that you don't snitch, you don't squeal, you don't rat, you don't tell. That also applies to prisoners who will attack you, sexually assault you, rob you, and literally make a weak flunky out of you. You can't tell the guards this, because if you do, not only will the prisoner who is snitched on, who is reported, attempt to kill you as a code, the informer code.
And often succeed.
And often succeeds, or other prisoners will take it upon themselves. There's a feeling that once you tell the guard even something legitimate, like a gang wants to rape you, or a gang wants to rob you, or have already raped and robbed you, even if it's legitimate, then they don't know at what point you can start to tell other things. So that this type of a code is iron.
And
you know that Patty Hearst is in danger now, because there are rumors that she may want to discuss things that she is familiar with about her past 19 months, about other people she'd met. And although we have no knowledge yet whether this is what she plans to do, there is no knowledge of it, at the same time the newspapers already are putting banner headlines that if she does this, her life will be endangered. So you see then that
within the prison system?
Within the prison system. Liddy, by the way, who did not report on his work in the Watergate burglaries and other events connected with it, is highly admired at Danbury prison for that. Whereas the others who were informing, their lives were in danger. You see, John Dean was terrorized that if he ever enters prison, they'll kill him for having informed on the various things that Watergate was exposed. So you see, then, there is no hope. You know,
and in fact,
the prison does have that famous sign, you know, you're doomed, those who enter. Nobody inside the prison, an inmate, dares reveal what's being done to them, except in the danger that they'd be either killed or mutilated or beaten, you know, within an inch of their lives.
And not only by the inmates, but you say that by the guards.
By the guards
simply
as well,
do not
yes.
want to hear it and deny it, and will go at great lengths to disguise what has been done to the prisoner as something else if he persists in his case. Is that right?
The majority of guards, by the way, are literally like the majority of the audience and of the people. They are really not different, except that their jobs are tougher and the roles they have to play become more vicious. If we were to get the majority of the correction staff, we would find that they are not sadists per se, and they do not want to make of a prisoner someone who is so hurt and ready to take revenge for their stay there. Dostoevsky, in
Crime and Punishment?
He had written a book on his experiences in prison. It's called The House of the Dead, which is, I think, the only way to describe prisons, not then alone, but today in America as well, and in the rest of the world. He said that for the first month, any prisoner who literally did something antisocial and was guilty might carry his guilt inside the prison. But at the end of the month, the prison does so many crimes against this prisoner and all the prisoners that after that, society, according to each prisoner, owes them for what was done to them. That's why Dr. Menger called his widely read book The Crime of Punishment, that prisons are a crime because the punishments so exceed whatever the prisoners may have done that all prisoners come out looking for revenge on the community. So recidivism, a return to the prison, occurs constantly. 95% of all prisoners who are, in quotes, supposed to be rehabilitated are returned back to the prisons after leaving the prisons. And the reason, the big single reason, is that the prison does so many crimes against them above and beyond anything that's in the nature of constructive human treatment or rehabilitation, that we're creating, we're designing. We are utterly skillful in manufacturing much more dangerous criminals for every criminal we release from prison. So we have two choices: throw away the key and not let a prisoner get out again, or genuinely rehabilitate them. And since we're not doing the rehabilitation and we're not throwing away the key, then the community is endangered by every prison producing more lethal threats with prisoners after they come out.
And you say 99 of them do come out.
99% at the end of a year and a half are released. We're terrorized, by the way, when they are let out, when they escape. You know, we send out our vans and our reports, and newspapers are screaming, you know, 2 prisoners escaped. Well, when we release them, legitimately, legally, all that happens is that we get worse prisoners than if they had escaped, excuse me, because they had gotten extra years of vengefulness and of crimes done to them.
And also learning the techniques of crime themselves. We have about...
That is the biggest program, by the way, the biggest study program in the prisons. 2
minutes. I want to ask you...
Wow, that went fast.
You mentioned Warden Case and bringing the community in to work. Are there other forms of rehabilitation? And then I want to ask you what you're working on now to close.
Right. There are only 2 ways to rehabilitate 90% of the prisoners who can be rehabilitated. The other 10% would need intensive care inside maximum security prisons. 90% will need halfway houses where they're given vocational training so they can work on a job and come back there. The other prisoners could simultaneously be given either high school or college training in these halfway houses. These are the only answers for these 90% of the prisoners. There are no other answers.
What are you working on now?
Dr. Stephen Kempster and Mrs. Ray Weiss, who is a therapist in the city hospitals, and myself have just researched a book on treatment of people who are mentally depressed. This is clinical and subclinical mental depression. 70 million American people are suffering from this disease, and this book deals with treatment for these people who are all endangered by the disease to the degree that suicide is very close.
It's that extreme when you
That
say
extreme.
even
Yes,
subclinically.
Right.
Thank you for coming tonight. You've been very interesting, and I recommend your book highly. It's Terror in the Prisons. We've been talking to Carl Weiss. The book is published by Bob Smerrill. I'm Jessie Gray, and the program is Books. Have a nice evening.